Good morning, everyone. My name is Yofi Tirosh. I come from the building next door of the law faculty, and I'm very happy to be here. I'm sorry I wasn't able to be yesterday, and I won't be able to stay. It's the end of the semester. I'm the vice dean, and it's crazy. And on top of that craziness, I'm sure this came up yesterday. The stormy tectonic shifts in Israel these days, which will be covered, I think, in many ways in the presentations of this panel, which talks about the intersections of many forms of oppression, and we will hear about violence against Palestinians, LGBTQ+, women, literal violence, symbolic violence. So I'm very happy to open this session. I'll say to the speakers that as a matter of good academic citizenship, I will be strict about the time. So each speaker will have 20 minutes and I will signal 5 minutes before time is up. Our first speaker is Chiara Langerame, and I hope I'm pronouncing the name right. She's a postgraduate student at the University of Salerno in Italy, where she obtains a master's degree in international relations in 2022. She's interested in gender studies and post-colonial and decolonial feminist theories, with particular regard to their application to the Swana region. In the last 3 years, she has focused her research on Palestine, Israel, and especially on the unique conditions of Palestinian LGBTQ+ people through the lens of intersectionality. Chiara, please.
Yes, good morning. I hope that you can hear me well. And thank you for this kind presentation. And I also would like to thank you for this opportunity to be here and discuss about violence and particularly on intersecting violence. Thinking on intersecting violence, Kimberly Crenshaw said that if you're standing at a crossroads of multiple forms of exclusion, you're likely to get hit by both. In fact, our bodies are to witness and experience violence in proportion to certain features inscribed in them. First and foremost, race and gender. In my research, I have focused on race and gender, try to understand how the two can combine to create even more harm, assuming that some people's bodies are sites of violence much more than others. I am a woman, hence I will have to be a victim of gender and sexual violence during my life. But at the same time, I'm a white, Western, European, cisgender, and then I'm a privileged woman. Hence, because I will probably never be a victim of colonial or racialized violence, neither of homophobic one. When I acknowledged my privileged position, I thought that I could use it to give an account of the conditions that shape the lives of those people who are not privileged as I am, about those people who are victims of an intersection of violence and that too often are still condemned to invisibility or reduced to their subjugation and victimhood, also in the academic discourse. I've always been an LGBTQI+ ally and sensitive to the Palestinian cause. And when I've started doing my research, I've noticed some similarities in the way in which these two groups of people are treated in the academic and non-academic discourse. Racialized queer bodies are a symbol of intersectional violence and are too often still poorly represented and included in public sphere and even in academic reflections. It is better to make them invisible or at least try to normalize them. The same happens to Palestinian people who are still too often described, especially in the Western world and in Italy as well, through categories dense with prejudices and distortions, the homogenization with Arabs or the association with terrorism that contribute to their invisibility and the misunderstanding of the struggle. That is why I have chosen to investigate the unique condition of Palestinian LGBTQI+ people through the lens of intersectionality. The violence inflicted upon these bodies comprises of both colonial and heteronormative systems of oppression, and the impossibility of considering colonial violence without its intersection with the gender violence is a well-established agreement among post-colonial thinkers. Pateman and Mills defined the intersection of these oppressive systems as racial patriarchy. This expression refers to the establishment of specific relations of power among human beings, a legacy of the colonial past. And in these relations of power, race and gender function as tools of colonial domination in the way in which they determine the inclusion or exclusion of bodies, the privileged and the subaltern. This exclusionary mechanism is reinforced by the seeming stability of those systems of oppression, which requires the physical and symbolic invisibility of the subalterns, which requires them to be deprived of any form of agency in order to stifle their subversive potential. In fact, a fundamental aspect of the maintenance of colonial spaces, cleverly constructed along the line of race and gender, is that all bodies inhabiting the spaces have to occupy the place that has been assigned to them. The legacy of the colonial past also colonizes our mindsets, as evident from the logic underlying the perception of the bodies of colonized, queer, and racialized people. According to this logic, those bodies are incapable of acting as ontological subjects, incapable of thinking and defining themselves. They are constructed as inferior bodies by nature, and therefore relegated to a position of immutable inferiority and subalternity in relation to the only subject, the Zionist settler in this case, who precisely because of his ontological superiority has the capacity and the right, among other things, to define themselves and their non-existence. Hence, the spaces in which our bodies move and manifest themselves have been organized by these white hegemonic masculinities that have the power of defining these spaces and defining other bodies. What would happen then if subaltern bodies claim the space that was not meant for them and from which they have been historically excluded? What would happen if those bodies invaded these spaces dominated by hegemonic white masculinities? Nirmal Puar defined these bodies with the expression space invaders because resisting racial patriarchy, they try to invade spaces that were not designed from them, from which they have always been kept at the margins because they could destabilize the prearranged order, the symbolic order of white and heteronormative patriarchy. In fact, the presence of a space invader's body, which breaks the semblance of harmony orchestrated by the racial patriarchy, arouses a profound sense of unease and disorientation, provoking what Puar called a state of ontological anxiety. That is the case of Palestinian LGBTQI+ people, whose bodies are sites of intersections of multiple forms of violence caused by some feature that characterize their bodies and their collective stories. First, these bodies are Palestinians, and since they are Palestinians, they are racialized and colonized bodies that have to be eliminated in the framework of the Zionist ideology to pursue the objective of creating a Jewish state for a Jewish people. Wolf analyzed this relationship between Israel and Palestine through the structure of settler colonialism, whereby the settlers, the Zionists' fundamental goal, is the physical and symbolic elimination of the native Palestinian population as an obstacle to their very existence. This logic has manifested itself for over 75 years of occupation, forced displacement, spoliation, segregation, and inferiorization. Nevertheless, they are not just Palestinians, they are LGBTQI+ Palestinians, and being Palestinians and LGBT at the same time expose them to a terrible intersection of violence. As queer and non-heteronormative, these bodies have to be eliminated or at least neutralized as well, because they undermine the comfortive order established by white heteropatriarchy, in which white heterosexual men represent the privileged apex. Judith Butler talks about the object as a person that needs to be kept at the margin and controlled because it does not enjoy the status of the subject. It can be said that abjection, according to me, is the existential condition of Palestinian queer people who, like objects, are forced within the Zionist colonial system from which they are, however, pushed to the margins. Palestinian queer people, while suffering the intersection of multiple forms of exclusion, pose an enormous threat to the established order. On the one hand, as Palestinians, and therefore indigenous people, they risk to undermine the colonial order whose existence is guaranteed by the aforementioned logic of the elimination of the native. On the other hand, as queer persons, they also risk to undermine the symbolic order of heteronormative patriarchy, because the object is above all one which threatens identities, rules, boundaries. That is why Palestinian queer people could be described as the objects of the objects. The control and attempted normalization of object bodies can also take place by the adoption of sexual policies in which gender and sexuality are used as instrument of domination, as such in the case of homonationalism and rainbow-washing policies. According to Just Be Poor, Israel is a pioneer of homonationalism, and she used the expression of the gay decade in order to describe the period between the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, in which, through a series of reforms of its penal code, Israel has legitimized and included the presence and existence of LGBTQI+ people in its body politic. Poor described the process of inclusion, initially going to describe the development in the USA after terrorist attacks of 9/11, of a strategy whereby, by protecting the rights of LGBTQI+ people and emphasizing tolerance and acceptance toward them, the state includes sexual minorities in the construction of a nationalism in which, and this construction of this nationalism make the country appear as the best in the protection of LGBTQI+ rights. At the same time, however, Muslim citizens, the Palestinians in this case, are portrayed as the others, intolerant, backward, unable to integrate into liberal societies, and ultimately a threat to democratic culture. In 2005, in Israel, this strategy turned into the national campaign Brand Israel, precisely to relaunch a new image of the Israeli state as a modern democracy and an inclusive country, an effort to improve Israel's negative image overseas caused by some events like the military intervention in Lebanon or the imposition of the blockade on Gaza. Therefore, it was necessary to clean this image through pinkwashing and rainbow-washing policies. The term pinkwashing was first used by Sarah Schumann in an editorial in the New York Times in 2011 to define the State of Israel's strategy of upholding the rights of LGBTQI+ people through the promotion of LGBTQI+ tourism, for example, or the inclusiveness of the IDF, while simultaneously violating human rights in Palestine under occupation. These sexual policies make the Palestinian population appear as collective homophobic and backward, and Palestinian queer people victims of this homophobic society, deprived of any form of agency and therefore incapable of acting within an oppressive system that becomes as such in opposition to a model, the Zionist one, that conversely seems to fully reflect the respect for the standards of civilization established by those white hegemonic masculinities. Therefore, how are queer Palestinians resisting this intersection of violence? What can queer Palestinians do? And in order to better understand this process of intersectional resistance, I would say rainbow-washing policies, Zionist colonial oppression, and sexual oppression of the Palestinian patriarchal society itself, my research methodology uses both in-depth interviews and observation. I've observed the work of the Palestinian organization Al-Qaws for sexual and gender diversity in Palestinian society. Al-Qaws, which represents this Palestinian queer resistance, states its fundamental goals, which are three. First of all, against three main forms of hegemony. The first is the Palestinian patriarchal culture, along with its norms and taboos regarding sexuality. The second hegemony that Al-Qaws wants to dismantle is the hegemony of the Western LGBTQI+ organization and Western cultural imperialism when applying their understanding of sexual politics and rights to the rest of the world, ignoring the peculiarities of non-Western individuals. And the third is the Zionist colonization of Palestine. Hence, this resistance results in the creation of safe spaces where people can meet, discuss, and learn how to perform this queerness in a decolonial sense, or also in boycott campaigns that underline the need of the interconnection of this liberation struggle. In addition to the work of ALCOS, during my research, I also had the opportunity of interview some Palestinian LGBTQI+ activists now living in the diaspora that added a precious contribution to my research. All of them denounced the difficulties of accepting themselves in a heteronormative society, the additional difficulties of living in a country under occupation, and also the difficulties of the discussion with the LGBTQI+ community of the Israeli state. All of them tried to share with me the suffering caused by the violence of contemporary society sexism, the violence of racial patriarchy, and the violence of pinkwashing sexual policies that hinder the development and the manifestation of non-heteronormative existence within the public sphere, relegating them to the condition of subaltern objects. The findings from the observation and interviews shed light on the practices that queer Palestinians use to resist their multifaceted subjugation. They seek to invade spaces from which they have been excluded and in which they claim their own revolutionary existence and the visibility of their bodies. They do this by performing a decolonial queerness, pointing out the need to link the struggle of their sexual liberation to the struggle of the liberation of Palestine, because it is not possible for them to think of the liberation of the former without the liberation of the latter. Because if the forms of violence are intersected, I would say that also the resistance should be thought in an intersectional way. The experiences of Palestinian queer people, therefore, teach the need to work together for a decolonial queerness that, taking note of the symbolic arsenal inherited from the colonial experience, can produce a new discourse free of colonial prejudices that we have all inevitably internalized.
Chiara,
in this
you
common
have 5
struggle,
minutes.
yes, I'm just concluding. Because in this common struggle, as we said yesterday, I remember in the opening workshop, we should recognize ourselves in this part of this system of oppression. Because as Sartre said, this awareness, so recognizing ourselves part of this system, of the perpetrators, it will produce a sense of shame. But Marx said that the shame is a revolution in itself. Hence, this revolution is as urgent and necessary because people who are victims of an intersection of violence deserve justice and freedoms like other human beings and cannot wait this revolution to happen no longer. Thank you.
Thank you very much.